Hello, this is a short video on mercantilist economic history and theory, I guess you could say. So I'm going to get started. On the cover page, I've included a few mercantilist leaders, Louis XIV in France and Queen Elizabeth I in England, both very good examples of mercantilist leaders. Um, Louis's palace, Versailles, that he built is a good physical representation of what mercantilism would look like if it were put into art form, because it really sort of functions like mercantilism should function. And you'll see what I mean by that when I get there. But layout, what am I going to talk about? Background information. So first, what is mercantilism? Second, what's going on when mercantilism is really thought of and comes to be an accepted form of economics across nations, because without understanding the history, it's you don't necessarily understand why mercantilist leaders were doing what they were doing. And that kind of gets into the theory. What objectives and goals did mercantilism try to accomplish? That's based off of that historical setting. And with these goals and objectives in mind, what do mercantilists say should be done within the economy, within the nation? And third, what are some actual examples of mercantilist policies in France and England? What happened with mercantilism in Central and Eastern Europe? Because it's not as popular in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's actually more of a failure there. But to begin with, mercantilism, it's an economic system. It really becomes pretty dominant in Western Europe around 1400, and it lasts until around 1750, or the age of industrialization. There's no set start and end date for all of Europe, obviously. It largely depends on the nation itself. Um, Here's one good way to know, though, to sort of divvy them up. A nation that isn't centralized under a monarch really can't have a mercantilist system. So think of that as the absolute beginning of mercantilism in a nation. Not always the beginning, but potential start date. And the end date for most nations was when they went through industrialization, which was different for each nation. So mercantilism lasts for, a good 300, 400 years, though. Um, Interesting note, mercantilism wasn't identified as an economic policy or ideology until after the mercantilist period during the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith coined the term. He used it to compare laissez-faire capitalism to the preceding economic time period. So whenever he would make arguments about the invisible hand and supply and demand, all these capitalist arguments, he would compare them to the old mercantilist regime. That was the economic policy that was used in England prior to industrialization. Final note, just a little, I guess, disclaimer. The goals that are sought after during the mercantilist era are very different from economic goals today. So if they seem counterintuitive, or if the goals that are being pursued don't really seem to make sense, that's due in part to the history of the time period and what was going on. So, some historical setting. Mercantilism is really born out of the end of the Middle Ages. Mercantilism is the economic prescription to breaking up feudalism. I know I'm reading the bullet point verbatim, but when I say that, feudalism was a system that was very good for nobility. If you were a count or a duke or a baron, feudalism was really the best system you could have, because it gave you a lot of autonomy as a nobleman, and it gave you a lot of protection at the same time. For the king, though, of a nation, for the king of France, feudalism, it sucked, because the vast majority of the power in your nation, the vast majority of territory and population actually wasn't under your direct control. It was under the control of those dukes and counts and barons and all those noblemen. So in order to have a centralized nation, which most nations of the world today are centralized nations. There are very few that are decentralized, and it's like Somalia, like countries like that are the most decentralized. There are elements of decentralization in each nation, but in the sense of a true decentralized nation, they almost don't even exist today. But before the mercantilist period, they were all decentralized in Western Europe. There were no centralized nations. And mercantilism is actually, without mercantilism, I don't know if you would have national economies the way you do today. So mercantilism is a very important time period. It's just a little different from what people today are used to. So just to kind of illustrate how mercantilism tries to break up the feudal system, or the manor system is the economic system associated with feudalism. But so under the feudal system, right, you have the king. The king is a nobleman. He has his own feudal estate. He has his own land, his own peasants, his own serfs. He can produce his own stuff. But the reason why the king is powerful is because he makes a feudal contract with all of these people. And here's how they do it. The king accepts an oath from these dukes. The dukes agree that they'll provide him with income, provide him with soldiers. In exchange, the king has to obviously protect the land of France. He has to settle disputes. He has to be a good civic administrator. The counts, therefore, pledge their loyalty to the duke, and therefore, by extension, to the king, and so on and so forth. Now, what you'll quickly notice is, though, the King of France doesn't have the right to enter the Duke's land, take his agricultural output, and leave him holding the bag. No, he can't do that because the Dukes can simply walk away from the king. What you'll notice is, though, that all of these people, if you were to sum all of their land holdings and population holdings, they most likely have equal to what the king has in his own estate, or probably more than what the king has in his estate. So they collectively have more power within the nation than the king does. Now that's a big no-no for the king, because that means there's a check on what he can or can't do. You can't have an absolute monarchy under this sort of feudal system, because these guys can say, sit and spin, we don't want to go along with what you're doing, we're just going to go put a new king on the throne. And he really can't do anything about it. I've never heard, I can't think of, doesn't mean there isn't one, but I can't think of a king who willingly left the throne to let one of these dukes take over for him. And if they did fight against these noblemen, they usually, a lot of times they lost. So from the perspective of the king, mercantilism tries to get rid of all this garbage down here from the perspective of the king, and make a direct link between the king and all of the resources that these people are sitting on. You don't have to go through all of this feudal nonsense when you have a mercantilist system in place. So with that in mind, there are three main goals I would categorize them as for mercantilists. Different people obviously might have different numbers of goals. You might break these three up into 5 or 6 or 2. These are basically, though, the general, the agenda that they wanted to push as they were adopting these mercantilist policies. Number one, you want to, as we previously stated, centralize the nation. You want to prevent challenges to the throne from whatever type of nobleman or pretender is going to rise up. Number two, you want to enrich and empower your state as much as possible. Number three, you want to increase your competitive standing of your own nation relative to all of your competitors, your foreign enemies, if you will. To go into these goals in a little bit more detail, centralizing the state we talked about a lot earlier, but just to kind of give an example of this, think of conflicts like the War of the Roses, any war of succession. Whenever the king dies or the king has a weak mandate to assume the throne, there's usually going to be a war of some kind. The noblemen are going to try to rise up, they're going to try to take more power from you, etc. So, if you're the king, a mercantilist goal is, well, how can I do one of two things? I either need to A, strengthen my own power as the king, strengthen my own feudal estate, or B, I have to find a way to weaken the nobles. And mercantilism kind of does both. This goal in particular, though, that I've identified, specifically tries to weaken the power of the noblemen. Um, Obviously, this is a domestic issue. It's not really a foreign one. That's going to be important later when we talk about what types of policies mercantilists implement. There's foreign and domestic. Moving on to goal number 2, enriching the state. This is sort of that first option for what the king can do, strengthen himself, strengthen his own power. At this period in history, the king is the state. When France becomes more powerful, the king becomes more powerful. If France gains 100,000 ingots of silver, the king effectively gains 100,000 ingots of silver. Therefore, as a mercantilist king, you want to enrich and empower your state as much as possible, and you want to use every advantage you can to do so. You can use war, you can explore the new world, you can establish trade routes with, the Ottomans or the Indians. You can do whatever you want to try to enrich your state. Now, in order to do that, you're going to need a lot of money, obviously, so you're going to want to increase your money, and that leads to more power. Or vice versa, chicken and the egg thing. You get more power, you can get more money. Either way, you want to make the state as healthy and as strong as you possibly can. And the easiest way to do that for a king is to do one of two things: increase your population or increase your territory. Both very simple. More people means more production. You can have, if you have 100,000 serfs, theoretically, you can work twice the number of fields as if you have 50,000 serfs. Likewise, you want to have as much territory as you can. Even if the territory doesn't have minerals on it, maybe you can grow corn on it, maybe you can't grow anything on it, maybe it has a coal deposit. You want to just control as much land as you can, because land at this point in time also is an arm of power. If you have land, you have power. That's how those noblemen have power. Goal number 3, you want to become as strong competitively as you possibly can relative to your neighbors. So if you're the king of France, not only do you want to become more powerful and rich for yourself, but you also want to become more powerful than your neighbors. You want to become more powerful than Burgundy, than Brittany, than Switzerland, than all of those nations that you're competing with. This sort of view of diplomatic relations in game theory, which is a branch of mathematics or economics, whatever you want to call it, you would say it's a zero-sum game from a mercantilist perspective. And what that means is that when France and Burgundy compete, the two nations, one of them is going to lose and one of them is going to win. Whatever the loser loses becomes the winner's gain, or vice versa. A good example of that is the Treaty of Tordesillas. I don't speak Spanish, so I don't know, or Portuguese, I don't know what language that, I don't know how the pronunciation is supposed to be honest with you. It's the treaty that's signed between Portugal and Spain that divides up North and South America. So, as we previously pointed out, for a mercantilist, exploration is one of the things you can do to increase your own wealth and power. Well, this treaty divides North and South America between Portugal and Spain, and it gives Portugal the nation of Brazil and Spain everything else, the modern nation of Brazil. Now, from the Spanish perspective, think about what that's doing. That's giving them a lot of resources, a lot of land to work with, a lot of people to work with, obviously. But what it's also doing is it's depriving Portugal of all that opportunity. So not only are they gaining wealth for themselves, but they're also preventing Portugal from getting all that extra power and wealth. That's a good example of a zero-sum way of thinking during the mercantilist period. And therefore, it kind of goes without saying that war, intimidation, cutthroat trading, they're all acceptable forms of diplomatic relations. You can go to war and take territory. Nobody's going to hold it against you. They're going to be bitter if they lose, but, everybody's doing it at this point in time, so why not get in on the action? So, in order to achieve these goals, you have a number of different prescriptions or policy ideas that mercantilists cooked up to accomplish them. And they basically come in two flavors. There's things you do internally within your nation on the domestic front, and there are things you do on the international scene, how you interact with other states as the king. So, take them in turn. Domestic policies, right? You want to deprive the nobles of as much power as you can. Now, here's what you can't do. You can't walk up to the Duke of Anjou and say, "Oh, I'm just going to take all your land, all of your serfs. They're indentured to me now. You go away. I don't care where you go. Just go away." You can't do that because all of those noblemen, once again, are just going to get together and kick you off the throne. But implicitly, you can do things that weaken the nobles, and I've highlighted one example of this. During the mercantilist period, serfdom still existed. And I have another video if you're interested on manorialism and serfdom, if you would like to know more about what that is in detail. But serfdom existed during the mercantilist era. But what the mercantilist monarchs did was they made it so that serfs could move from feudal estate to feudal estate and serve different lords, in most cases. So what this does is, if the Duke of Anjou is being a real pain for the king, maybe all of a sudden a lot of the Duke of Anjou's serfs go and work for the Duke of Orleans, right? Because the Duke of Orleans is a much more... he's willing to play the ball game with the king. In doing this, what you do is you break up that monopoly of power that the noblemen have. It doesn't strip them of all their noble rights. Keep that in mind. They're still pretty powerful, but by nationalizing your economy, and this really is the first step to nationalizing an economy, by allowing people to move wherever they want to effectively to work. Let me refer. You can become indentured to another lord and move around you can move around the nation. I'm going to phrase it like that. You can move around the nation. By doing that, you're creating a national economy and you're weakening the noblemen. Second domestic goal, second domestic policy. You want to invest in any project that is going to strengthen the state. That means you're going to build a road so that merchants can get from Poitiers to Lyon much quicker. You're going to build canals and harbors so that you can dock up at Bordeaux, or I don't know, what's a French coastal city? I'm blanking on a French coastal city. You're going to dock up in Normandy and ship off those finished products to England. You're going to build fortifications. You're going to build castles along the border so that when you go to war with Spain to take over Roussillon, you're going to have an advantage over them. You're going to invest in any project that is going to make the state more powerful. Third, domestic policy. You're going to try and encourage the production of resources within your nation at a greater level than they currently are. So here's what that means. You're going to try to turn any unused land that could be used to grow crops into farmland. You're going to try to find every iron mine you can, every stream of iron, and extract as much of it as you can. This also means that you're going to try to find substitutes of resources you don't natively have to use within your nation. And think about the logic of that. If you're going to be going to war, if you're France and you need tin, let's say tin. Let's say you're France, you need tin. Burgundy's got tin. Well, if you're going to be going to war with Burgundy every 30 years, you're probably not going to want to rely on them for your tin production. So what you're going to do is you're going to try to get your own citizens to find a way to supplement tin with copper, or supplement it with some other mineral, some other thing that they can use. Now, is that always going to work? No, it's not going to always work. but you get that sort of push for innovation of synthetic materials, of alternative substitutes, things like that. On the foreign front, it's primarily focused on trade and war. you know, a little bit different than today, obviously. But number one, you're going to want to restrict your import of finished goods, and you're going to want to restrict your exports of raw materials. And again, think about the logic of this. Finished goods indicate that the greatest amount of income and value added has been produced by the good. So for example, you take lumber. Lumber, you're going to turn it into furniture. Let's just make it a really easy lumber to cabinets. That's a finished good. If you're the king of France, you're going to want to import as few cabinets as possible. In fact, you're probably not going to want to import any at all. You're going to want to you can import the lumber and then turn the lumber into cabinets, but you're never going to want to import cabinets. Why? Because you can produce them yourself. You can import lumber, you can grow lumber, you can make nurseries, harvest the lumber, and make them yourself, and make more money off of them. Likewise, though, it's easier to understand from this standpoint. You never want to export raw materials to foreign nations. Let's use the lumber and the cabinets example. If you're France and you produce 100 units of lumber, and you export that 100 units of lumber to Burgundy, Burgundy's going to turn around, they're going to turn those 100 units of lumber into 10 cabinets, and they're going to ship those cabinets back to you for a higher markup, and they're going to walk away with a net inflow of money, of coin, of gold. That's a big no-no if you're a mercantilist. Why? Because again, remember, you're competing against all of these foreign nations. So what you want to do is you want to export as many finished goods as you can to generate coin and money for your nation, and you want to import raw materials, if anything. But again, you really don't want to import a lot of things, but raw materials are acceptable to import. They're not desirable to import, but they're acceptable. I just kind of talked about both A and B at the same time. So we're going to move on to C. C, related to these two, you want to stockpile as much money, as much gold and silver as you can for your nation. And you can do that a variety of different ways. Again, you can do it through trade, you can do it through war, you can do it through taxation, you can do it through all sorts of things. Why do you want to stockpile all of this money, all of these ingots of gold and this coin? Well, because if you're going to be going to war and you're going to be exploring, establishing colonial networks, establishing colonies, you're going to need money to do so. You need money in order to seed Columbus going off to the New World. You're going to need money if you're going to hire a bunch of Swiss mercenaries to attack Burgundy for you. You're going to need money to build those roads and those harbors. Now, interestingly enough, this is where that comment about it being counterintuitive to modern economics comes into play. One would suspect if you're stockpiling lots of gold and silver in your nation, you're going to be making inflation in your nation, which the effects of inflation are going to run counter to a lot of these trade goals you have. But for mercantilists, that's not the issue is not having a good balance of payments necessarily. Your issue is you're going to want to, again, those three goals: strengthen the nation, consolidate power, make yourself better than everybody else, basically. So I think that covers why you want to stockpile gold and silver. It's fairly straightforward. D, whenever you have an opportunity to beat one of your neighbors, you want to compete with them. If that means you're going to go to war with them because you know you can win, you're going to go to war with them and you're going to take 10 acres of land, or you're going to make them pay you 500 ingots of gold, what have you. If that means you're going to explore Cuba and Mexico before Portugal, and then you're going to say only we can settle there, you're going to do it. You're going to spend that, and you're going to invest that money, and you're going to beat Portugal so that they can only have Brazil and you have the other, 80% of Central and South America, whatever the proportion of land mass and population is. So those are basically the theoretical prescriptions, the theoretical mercantilist policies you can enact in order to reach those goals. the actual policies of mercantilists are actually sort of. I'm not trying to make fun of them. I'm not. I'm really not. They're sort of severe in some cases. They're very. They like punishing people when they don't follow mercantilist rules and procedure. But let's look at France and England during the mercantilist period. So, as I previously stated, Louis XIV is really, I would argue, the epitome of French mercantilism. His finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, is the one who oversaw a lot of the mercantilist policy implementation. So he did a couple of things. Number one, he wanted to standardize the quality of goods being produced in France by crafting guilds. Guilds are, they're sort of similar to unions. They're collections of tradesmen and artisans and craftsmen. So there's a guild for carpenters, a guild for jewel makers, jewel crafters, what have you. This relates to these prescriptions related to trade and production. By standardizing things, you're ensuring a certain quality, a certain value added to all of your goods when you're exporting them for that money. You're ensuring production is being optimized, or optimized according to what the finance minister says. So, he sets these standards for crafting guilds, right? Clothing, tailors. He sets a tailoring standard about clothing, and if a tailor was found to have an inferior product, he was tied up with his own clothing and basically humiliated and punished in public, like castigated in public. Okay, so, and that's on a first offense, mind you. This isn't like, oh, we're going to talk to you first, and then the second offense, we're going to string you up with the clothes. No, the first offense is we're going to tie you to a pole with the shirt you made that has a seam running 34 degrees from the chest. Or what? I'm not a tailor. I don't know what, but you know, very severe punishments, and you'll see that in England too. It's actually even more severe in England. But protectionism, trade. Going back to the goals, this is A and B for that, and C to some by extension. But A and B for protectionism. Colbert saw massive tariff increases, because tariffs obviously are going to, other things the same, push down imports from foreign lands. He simply banned foreign imports of certain goods, and obviously he promoted domestic exports. So he promoted them shipping cabinets overseas with different policies, different subsidies, different incentives. Lastly, he oversaw the construction of lots of roads, canals, harbors, all of those infrastructure projects, so that commerce could more easily flow across the new national economy of France. That's that whole, making serfs be able to live wherever they want. That's, the roads, the canals, they help them get from place to place. So you're really satisfying the first two goals with this action by investing in infrastructure. You're weakening nobles to some extent and centralizing the nation. You're making a national economy. And these are also capital investments that are going to help your nation generate more money in the long run, going based off of current economic models. I don't know if I would assume they thought the same thing. I don't. I've never read that anywhere, so don't quote me on that one. Versailles. This is just a little segue, I guess. Versailles, if you think about it, is like the artistic representation of what mercantilism should be. So think about it. Versailles is this ornate, elegant place of power, the seat of Bourbon power under Louis XIV, the Sun King, right? It's a sign of wealth and of power. What does Louis XIV do in Versailles? Well, he has the nobles come and he spies on them. He gets them all drunk. He gets them all happy, or he intimidates them. I don't know what he does in Versailles with them, but he basically tries to control the nobility by physically keeping them in this palace, right? And it's also showcasing his power to, his cousin, who's the king of Naples, when he comes to visit. So Versailles, in my opinion, this is not, objective. This is completely subjective. But Versailles, if you want a good artistic representation of mercantilism, yeah, it's Versailles. It's a very good indication of what a good manifestation of what mercantilism should look like if it were in building form. Um, Moving on, England. England is obviously also another good example of a nation that instituted mercantilist policies, and Elizabeth I is another good leader to showcase this mercantilist policy. She does does the same basic things as Colbert. She tries to prevent the export of raw materials, as we talked about. You don't ever. That's a big no-no if you're giving lumber to France, if you're England, to make cabinets out of. So livestock. Under the Elizabethan interpretation, livestock is a raw material. I mean, if take sheep or cattle, for example, you can slaughter them, make meat. You can shear the sheep, make wool and clothing. Livestock are raw materials. So, if you were found to be exporting livestock, exporting sheep to France or any other nation abroad, you would basically have your property confiscated, your family lineage would be tarnished, you would be physically maimed, and that was, again, on a first offense. And if you did it again, if you exported your livestock again, you were put to death. So, yeah, England is a little... I don't know who's more severe. I haven't looked up all of the criminal codes. I mean, they're probably both pretty severe and pretty draconian. But, just another example of mercantilist punishment for breaking the economic rules. On a different front, although Colbert in France also pushed for exploration, but he was not successful. France at that time was not successful with establishing colonies, I should say, especially in India. They were not successful. But with Elizabeth, you have, Francis Drake exploring North America. Within half a century of Elizabeth, you're going to get Jamestown and other North American settlements. So that's another example of trying to use all of those advantages you have to enrich and empower your nation. On a more specific note, with regard to war, I should say, you have the development of the English fleet during the mercantilist era. Why do you need a fleet? Well, if you're going to be having these colonies founded by, discovered by Drake and later colonized, you're going to need a massive fleet to transport all of those goods, all of that gold, all of that tobacco, all of those goods you're going to produce. You need to protect them from, your foreign competitors, because you don't want Spain, who has a big navy, hijacking your stuff. This is not related, by the way. The Spanish Armada tried to take over Spain because they didn't want Elizabeth on the throne to begin with, but that's another story. But you don't want another nation that has a navy plundering your goods coming from your colonies. Fleets are a good example of that military investment we talked about earlier with your objective. If you control the seas around your nation and you can establish those colonial networks, you're increasing the power of your nation, your state, therefore yourself, and you're also increasing your power over your neighbors. So mercantilism is also when a lot of fleets were initially developed. Before that, you really did, if you're the Duke of Anjou, you really don't need to have a fleet of 100 galleys sailing from Provence to Naples. You really don't need to have that. But when you're running a multi-continent empire, yeah, you need a fleet in order to move all of the goods across. So now I'm going to just talk a little bit about mercantilism in other places outside of Western Europe. So mercantilism really doesn't ever take off in Eastern Europe. I put Japan on there for a very specific reason I'll talk about later. Different monarchs in Eastern Europe, like Russia, they tried to enact mercantilist policies, but they couldn't. They couldn't get it to last. And there's a couple different... It's different for each nation, obviously, but take for example Russia. Russia, they have a very strong noble class, the boyars. They're very powerful in Russia. Peter the Great is an enlightened monarch. He wants to centralize Russia, become powerful, and he's largely successful, but he could never make a lasting mercantilist regime within Russia. Why? There's a couple reasons. One, the boyars, very powerful. Obviously, they pushed back when he tried to when he tried to make inroads and erode their power. The nobles pushed back, and he either, I don't know this specifically, if he succeeded or if his successors failed, which it was, but either, whatever the case was, it was unsuccessful in the long run. He could never break up that boyar class, and that's part of the reason why you have serfdom in Russia up until the 19th century, and why communism is able to develop and gain so much traction there. That's part of the reason why. But in addition to that, Russia also really didn't have, it was not a developed country like England or France were. It didn't have a business class in any sense, really. There really wasn't a merchant class. And again, without a weak nobility that he could impose this national economy on, if you don't have a business class, you really don't have any way to enforce these mercantilist rules. You can't generate money if you don't have guilds to produce things, if you don't have those institutions. And that's the case in a lot of Eastern European countries. Russia's a good example because Peter the Great, he was successful in a lot of ways towards westernizing Russia, but he was not mercantilism never really came to places like Russia or Austria or even Germany, really, because the Junkers there, the noble class there, were also very well entrenched, and Germany had a completely different history, obviously, than France or England. I put Japan in here because, interestingly enough, there is... Don't think of it like this mercantilism. There's a new neo-mercantilism, if you will. Japan, if you're interested in learning about how these sorts of policies, these high barriers to trade, this promotion of investment and things like that, how they would apply to the contemporary world, Japan is one of the best countries to look at. They are... I've never seen an article that describes any nation as neo-mercantilist more than Japan in the 1970s and 80s, I believe. So if you're interested, I'm not going to talk about it. I've talked a lot more than I thought I was going to, so I apologize. But Japan is a really good nation to look up if you're interested in neo-mercantilism and neo-mercantilist thought. So I hope you found this video useful and somewhat informative. And thank you for watching if you made it this far.